Hey guys, tonight we begin with something most history books skip over. A time of chains, calluses, and complete powerlessness. We're diving into what life was really like for medieval slaves. Not servants, not peasants, but actual slaves. People owned like livestock, worked until they broke, and forgotten by history. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we think of medieval Europe, we picture knights and castles. But slavery? That's supposed to be ancient Rome, right? Wrong. Slavery didn't disappear when Rome fell. It evolved, shifted, and continued throughout the entire Middle Ages. From the 5th century all the way to the 15th century, millions of people lived and died in bondage. The church said slavery was acceptable as long as you didn't enslave fellow Christians, which meant if you weren't Christian, you were fair game. Muslims enslaved Christians. Christians enslaved Muslims. Vikings enslaved everyone they could grab. And the cycle continued for 1,000 years. Let me be clear about what we're talking about. Medieval slaves weren't like medieval serfs. Serfs were tied to land, yes, but they had some rights, some protections, some hope. Slaves had none of that. They were property. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed with minimal legal consequence. Their children were born into slavery. Their grandchildren too. This was generational ownership of human beings. And it happened everywhere. In Islamic Spain, Christian slaves scrubbed floors in palaces. In Venice, Slavic people were sold in markets so often that their ethnic name became the word for slave. In England, Anglo-Saxon slaves worked noble estates. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuch slaves ran the government. This wasn't rare. This wasn't hidden. This was normal. Tonight, we're following one full day in the life of a medieval slave. Not a specific person, but a composite. We'll walk through every hour from pre-dawn wake-up to midnight exhaustion. We'll see what they ate, how they worked, what they endured, and the tiny moments where they held on to humanity. Because that's the thing about slavery. It tries to erase your humanity, but people found ways to keep it alive. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in songs, sometimes just in surviving one more day. So let's begin. It's 3 a.m. somewhere in medieval Europe, and someone who doesn't own their own life is about to wake up. Number 1. Dawn. The day begins before light. Congratulations, you've just woken up. Except you didn't wake naturally. Someone kicked your leg or banged a stick against the wall or shouted until you jolted upright. It's 3 a.m., maybe 4 a.m. if you're lucky. The sun won't rise for hours. But your day is starting now because your master decided it should. You're a slave. You don't get to decide anything. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw on a dirt floor. Maybe a thin blanket if you're indoors. Maybe nothing if you sleep in the stable or the kitchen corner. You share this space with other slaves, maybe 10 or 15 of you crammed into a room meant for storage. The air smells like unwashed bodies, stale breath, and whatever work you did yesterday. If you worked in the tannery, you reek of urine and rot. If you worked in the stables, you smell like manure. If you worked in the kitchens, you're covered in grease and smoke. There's no bath waiting for you. There's no change of clothes. You stand up. Your joints ache because you're only 25, but your body feels 50. Years of hard labor, poor nutrition, and zero medical care have aged you faster than any free person. Your back hurts from yesterday's work. Your hands are calloused and cracked. Your feet are either bare or wrapped in rags because shoes are for people who matter. You're not people who matter. You're property. The wake-up call wasn't gentle. If you didn't respond fast enough, you got hit. A slap, a kick, a strike with whatever was handy. Not because you did anything wrong, just because you're slow. Obedience must be instant. Hesitation is defiance, and defiance is punished. So you learn to wake fast, move fast, and never ever complain. Around you, other slaves are stirring. An older woman with gray hair and a bent spine. A teenage boy whose growth was stunted by malnutrition. A man missing 2 fingers from a work accident that no one bothered to treat properly. A young girl, maybe 12, who was born into this life and knows nothing else. You don't talk much. Talking wastes energy. And besides, friendships are dangerous. If you get close to someone and they're sold away or worked to death, the grief is unbearable. So you keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your heart as numb as possible. There's no breakfast waiting. Not yet. First, you work. In many households, slaves had to complete morning chores before being allowed even a scrap of bread. Light the fires. Draw water from the well. Sweep the floors. Feed the animals. Prepare the master's breakfast while your own stomach growls. You move through the dark, half blind, stumbling over stones and tools, trying not to make noise that might anger someone still sleeping. Because if you wake the master too early, you'll pay for it. If you don't have his breakfast ready on time, you'll pay for that too. Let's talk about the different kinds of slaves you might be. If you're a household slave in a noble estate, you might have it slightly better than others. You're indoors most of the time. You're fed regularly, even if it's scraps. You wear hand-me-down clothes. Your life is still brutal, but you're not being worked to death in a mine. If you're an agricultural slave, you're out in the fields from sunrise to sunset, planting, harvesting, hauling. Your life expectancy is low. Your value is based entirely on how much work you can do before your body gives out. If you're a galley slave, chained to an or on a ship, you'll never see freedom again. You'll row until you die, sometimes sitting in your own waste because you're not allowed to leave your position. If you're a mining slave, your life expectancy is 2, maybe 3 years. The work is so brutal, the conditions so deadly, that you're essentially a disposable tool. And if you're a sex slave, your story is even darker. Used, abused, and discarded without a second thought. But let's stay with our household slave for now. It's still dark. You've lit the fire in the kitchen hearth. Your fingers are cold and clumsy. The flint and steel take forever to spark. Finally, a flame catches. You blow gently, coaxing it to life. This fire will cook the master's food, heat his water, and warm his hall. You will get none of that warmth. You'll spend the day near the fire, but never comfortable. Too close and you burn. Too far and you freeze. Other slaves are moving now too. The cook slave, an older woman who's been here for decades, starts preparing dough. The stable slave heads outside to feed the horses. The child slave, barely old enough to lift a bucket, is sent to fetch water. Everyone has a task. Everyone knows their place. And everyone knows that failure means punishment. Punishment could be anything. A slap across the face. A whip across the back. Being locked in a cellar for a day without food. Being sold to a worse master. In some regions, especially Islamic Spain and the Byzantine Empire, punishment could be brutal and creative. Slaves who tried to escape had their feet branded. Slaves who stole food had their hands cut off. Slaves who talked back were beaten in front of the others as a warning. You learn quickly not to make mistakes. But mistakes happen anyway because you're human. You're exhausted. You're starving. And you're living in constant fear. So you drop a plate, or you spill water, or you're too slow, and suddenly you're on the ground, and someone's boot is in your ribs. You don't cry out. Crying out makes it worse. You take it. You stand up. And you keep working. The room is filling with gray light now. Dawn is coming. The master will wake soon. And when he does, you'd better be ready. Because the day is just beginning. And it will not be kind. Number 2. Morning. Work without end. The sun is finally up. Not that it matters much to you. Sunlight doesn't mean freedom. It just means you can see the work more clearly. By now, you've already been awake for 2 or 3 hours. You've hauled water, lit fires, swept floors, and prepared food you won't be allowed to eat. And now the real work begins. If you're a household slave in a wealthy estate, your morning tasks are endless. The master's chambers need cleaning. The ladies' garments need washing. The children need watching. The guests need serving. Every single task is assigned to someone. And if you're that someone, you do it without question. There's no shift rotation. There's no time clock. You work until someone tells you to stop. And often, no one tells you to stop. Let's say you're assigned to the kitchens. Congratulations, you're standing in a hot, smoky room for the next 12 hours. Medieval kitchens were brutal places. Open fires, boiling pots, sharp knives, heavy cauldrons. Burns were common. Cuts were constant. And if you complained, you were replaced. The cook slave, usually a woman who'd been doing this for years, directs the chaos. She's not your friend. She's barely surviving herself. But she's been here longer, so she has a tiny bit of authority. And sometimes, people with tiny bits of authority are the cruelest because it's the only power they'll ever have. You chop vegetables. Turnips, onions, leeks. Your knife is dull because good knives are for free people. Your hands are raw from the repetitive motion. You stir pots of pottage, the same grim stew that peasants eat, but somehow even worse because you're using the scraps of the scraps. You roast meat over the fire, meat you'll never taste. The smell is torture. Your stomach cramps from hunger, but you keep working because stopping means punishment. If you're a field slave, your morning is different, but no less brutal. You're outside now, in the cold or the heat, depending on the season. Let's say it's harvest time. You're in a field with dozens of other slaves, bent over, cutting grain with a sickle. Your back is on fire within the first hour. Your hands bleed from gripping the rough wooden handle. The overseer, a free man hired to watch you, walks up and down the rows with a whip. Not because anyone's misbehaving, just because his job is to make sure you're working fast enough. And fast enough is always faster than you're currently going. There's no talking. Talking slows you down. Singing is sometimes allowed, but only if it's a work song that keeps rhythm. Some slave communities developed songs that sounded obedient but carried hidden messages. Warnings about the overseer. Plans to meet later. Prayers for strength. But you had to be careful. If the overseer suspected you were communicating, the whip came down. Children worked too. Medieval childhood didn't exist for slaves. If you were old enough to walk, you were old enough to work. 5-year-olds carried water. 7-year-olds fed chickens. 10-year-olds worked the fields alongside adults. They didn't go to school. They didn't play. They learned their place early and learned it hard. Let's talk about the skilled slaves. Because not all slaves did the same work. Some were trained in crafts. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, scribes. These slaves had a strange existence. They were still property, still powerless, but they had value beyond brute labor. A blacksmith slave, for example, might take pride in his work. He might feel a flicker of satisfaction when he forges a perfect blade. But that satisfaction is poisoned because the blade isn't his. The work isn't his. He's creating beauty and usefulness for a master who owns him completely. Skilled slaves were sometimes allowed small privileges. Better food. A private sleeping space. Permission to marry another slave. But these privileges were never rights. They could be taken away instantly. And they came with a dark trade-off. You were too valuable to be easily replaced, which meant you were expected to work even harder. If you were a weaver slave producing fine cloth, you were expected to weave faster, longer, and with perfection. Mistakes weren't tolerated. A ruined bolt of cloth could mean a beating. And then there were the slaves who worked in truly horrific conditions. Mining slaves. These men, and sometimes women, were sent into tunnels with minimal tools and no safety measures. They dug for ore, salt, or precious metals. Cave-ins were common. Lung disease was guaranteed. Most mining slaves died within a few years. They were expendable. When one died, another was purchased. The math was simple for the owner. A slave cost less than a free laborer and could be worked harder. Galley slaves had it even worse. Chained to their rowing benches, they lived and died at sea. They rowed in rhythm, driven by a drum or a whip. They ate at their posts. They defecated at their posts. When they died, their bodies were sometimes just thrown overboard and a new slave chained in their place. These weren't prisoners of war being temporarily detained. These were people bought and sold specifically for this purpose. Some galley slaves were criminals, yes, but many were just unlucky. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong ethnicity. Back to our household slave. It's mid-morning now. You've been working for hours. Your body is screaming for rest, but rest isn't coming. The master's family is awake now, which means more work. Serve breakfast. Clear the dishes. Wash the plates. Scrub the pots. Refill the water jugs. Tend to the gardens. Feed the dogs. Groom the horses. Every task leads to another task. There's no end. And through it all, you're invisible. The family talks around you like you're not there. They discuss private matters, argue, laugh, make plans. You hear everything. You see everything. But you're trained to forget it all. To be furniture. To be a tool. If you're caught listening too closely, you're punished. If you repeat what you've heard, you're punished worse. Silence isn't just expected. It's survival. Some slaves were brought into the household as children and raised alongside the master's children. This created a strange dynamic. You played together as kids. But as you grew older, the divide became clear. They got education. You got orders. They got freedom. You got chains. Some masters were kind in their own way. They didn't beat their slaves often. They provided decent food. But kindness from a master is still control. You're still owned. And kindness can evaporate the moment you step out of line. By noon, you've been working for 9 hours. Your hands are blistered. Your feet are aching. Your back is bent. And you're nowhere near done. Because the medieval day doesn't stop at noon. It keeps going. And so do you, whether you want to or not. Number 3. Midday, a moment's rest. It's midday now. The sun is high. The heat is brutal if it's summer. And your body is begging for a break. So does that mean you get one? Maybe. But probably not in the way you'd hope. The medieval world didn't have standardized labor laws. There was no mandated lunch break. Whether you rested depended entirely on where you were, who owned you, and what kind of work you were doing. And even when rest was allowed, it came with conditions. Let's start with the Mediterranean regions. In Islamic Spain, southern Italy, and the Byzantine Empire, the culture of the siesta existed. When the afternoon sun turned brutal, work often paused. Not out of kindness, but practicality. Heat stroke kills workers, and dead workers don't produce. So slaves were sometimes allowed to rest during the hottest part of the day. But this wasn't a luxurious break. You didn't get to nap in a comfortable bed. You collapsed in whatever shade you could find. Under a tree, in a doorway, on the ground. You rested with your eyes half open because falling into a deep sleep meant you might not wake when work resumed. And if you weren't back on your feet when called, punishment followed swiftly. In Northern Europe, the siesta culture didn't exist. The climate was cooler, so there was no natural pause in the day. You worked straight through. If you were lucky, you got a brief moment to eat something. A chunk of stale bread. A bowl of thin soup. Water if you were fortunate. But this wasn't a meal. It was fuel. You ate standing up, or squatting in a corner, or while still working. Chewing quickly because you knew someone would yell at you to get back to it. Food for slaves was never good. It was the leftovers of leftovers. Stale bread. Moldy cheese. Scraps of meat too gristly for the master's table. Vegetables that were starting to rot. Sometimes grain porridge so thin you could see through it. The goal wasn't to nourish you. The goal was to keep you alive long enough to work. Malnutrition was standard. Slaves were shorter on average than free people because of childhood starvation. Their teeth rotted early. Their bones were brittle. And they aged rapidly because their bodies were never given what they needed to heal or grow. But let's say you did get a midday break. What happened then? You weren't alone. Other slaves were resting too. And this is where something quietly rebellious happened. Friendships. These were technically forbidden. Masters didn't want slaves bonding. Bonded slaves could plan escapes. They could support each other emotionally, making them harder to break. They could organize resistance. So friendships were discouraged, sometimes violently. Slaves caught whispering too much were separated. Slaves who seemed too close were sold to different owners. But humans are social creatures. Even in the worst conditions, we reach for connection. So during these brief moments, slaves talked. Quietly, carefully. They shared names, though often not their real ones. They exchanged stories about where they came from before slavery. A village in the Slavic territories. A town in North Africa. A coastal region raided by Vikings. These stories were painful, but they were also proof. Proof that you existed before this. Proof that you were someone once. A child with a mother. A sibling with a family. A person with a name that meant something. Some slaves used this time to teach each other. An older slave might teach a younger one how to avoid the worst beatings. How to read the master's moods. Which overseers were crueler than others. This knowledge was survival. And it was passed down in whispers, in gestures, in quiet moments of solidarity that the masters never saw. There were also forbidden romances. Slaves fell in love. They formed partnerships, even though they had no legal right to marry. Some masters allowed slave marriages because it kept slaves more emotionally stable and less likely to run. But these marriages had no legal protection. Your spouse could be sold away tomorrow. Your children didn't belong to you. They belonged to the master. And if the master decided to separate your family, there was nothing you could do but weep. Some slave couples tried to keep their relationship secret. They met in the stables at night. They passed notes if they could write. They carved small symbols into walls or tools, little messages that said I was here, I loved someone, I mattered. These gestures seemed small, but they were everything. They were the only way to hold on to humanity when the world treated you like livestock. If you were caught resting too long, punishment was immediate. A slap, a shove, a day without food. In some estates, there were formal punishment systems. A slave who rested too long might be locked in a cellar overnight, or forced to work extra hours, or publicly whipped in front of the other slaves as a warning. The message was clear. Your body is not yours. Your time is not yours. Even your exhaustion is not yours. You rest when permitted. You work when ordered. And you never, ever complain. But here's the thing about humans. Even in slavery, we find small rebellions. Some slaves rested longer than allowed and risked the punishment because their bodies simply couldn't go on. Some pretended to work while actually moving slowly, conserving energy. Some faked illness, though this was dangerous. If the master believed you, you might get rest. If he didn't, you'd be beaten for lying. It was a gamble, and sometimes slaves lost that gamble badly. In some households, midday was when the slaves ate together. Not a feast, not even a decent meal, but together. And in that togetherness, there was a flicker of community. You weren't just a lone person suffering. You were part of a group. And that group, however broken, however powerless, was still a group. You saw the same faces every day. You knew who coughed at night, who cried quietly, who prayed, who had given up, and who still had a spark of defiance in their eyes. Midday was also when some slaves were tasked with serving the master's lunch. If you were a serving slave, you stood silently while the family ate. You refilled cups. You brought dishes. You cleared plates. And you did it all while pretending you weren't starving. The smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, and spiced wine filled your nose. Your stomach twisted with hunger. But you kept your face blank. You moved efficiently. You became invisible again. And then, just as quickly as it began, the break ended. The overseer's voice cut through the air. Back to work. The moment of rest, however brief, was over. You stood up, your joints stiff, your muscles aching. And you returned to the fields, the kitchen, the workshop, the stable. Because the day was only half over. And the second half was always harder than the first. Number 4. Afternoon. The skilled versus the expendable. The afternoon is when the divide between slaves becomes starkest. Not all slaves are treated equally. Some have skills that make them valuable. Others are seen as disposable, their bodies just tools to be used up and replaced. Let's explore that divide, because understanding it reveals just how calculated and cruel the system of medieval slavery really was. First, the skilled slaves. Imagine you're a blacksmith slave. You were captured young, maybe during a raid, and sold to a master who needed metalwork done. Instead of sending you to the fields, he apprenticed you to his smith. You learned to forge tools, horseshoes, weapons. Over the years, you became skilled. Now, you're valuable. Not free, but valuable. Your master won't beat you as often because damaged hands mean damaged work. You're given slightly better food because a weak blacksmith produces weak metal. You might even have your own small workspace, a forge where you labor alone. But here's the poison in that privilege. You're still a slave. Every hammer strike, every blade you forge, every horseshoe you shape belongs to someone else. You can't sell your work. You can't take pride in it publicly. And if you make a mistake, if you ruin a piece, the punishment is swift. Skilled slaves lived in a strange psychological space. They had pride in their craft, but that pride was tainted by powerlessness. Some blacksmith slaves became so skilled they were loaned out to other estates, their master renting them like equipment. They traveled, saw different places, met other slaves. But they always returned to their owner. Always. Then there are the scribes. In monasteries, Islamic courts, and Byzantine bureaucracies, educated slaves were used for administrative work. These slaves could read, write, and do mathematics. They copied manuscripts, recorded transactions, and managed correspondence. Some of these slaves held more day-to-day power than free servants because they controlled information. But they were still property. A literate slave in the Byzantine Empire might manage an entire household's finances, make decisions about purchases, and interact with nobility. But he could be sold tomorrow if his master wished. And that knowledge, that constant awareness of his precariousness, haunted him. Some skilled slaves were eunuchs, castrated boys who were raised to serve in courts and harems. This was especially common in Islamic and Byzantine territories. Eunuchs couldn't produce heirs, which made them politically safer. They were often trusted with sensitive tasks, guarding women's quarters, managing treasuries, serving as advisors. Some eunuchs rose to positions of immense influence. They advised caliphs and emperors, but they were still slaves. They had power without freedom, influence without autonomy, and the process of becoming a eunuch was brutal. Many boys died from the procedure. Those who survived were left physically and emotionally scarred. Now let's talk about the expendable slaves. The ones whose skills didn't matter because their only value was brute labor. Agricultural slaves, mining slaves, galley slaves. These people were worked until they broke. And when they broke, they were replaced. Agricultural slaves had it rough. Imagine you're in a field in southern Italy. It's August. The sun is merciless. You've been harvesting grain since dawn. Your hands are bleeding from gripping the sickle. Your back is bent at an angle that feels permanent. The overseer walks behind you with a whip. Not because you're slow, just because. Fear keeps you moving. You don't know how long you've been working. Hours blend together. All you know is that stopping isn't an option. Some agricultural slaves worked on massive estates owned by monasteries or nobles. These estates functioned almost like factories. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of slaves working the land. Planting, harvesting, threshing, hauling. The work was seasonal. During planting and harvest, you worked from dawn to dusk. During winter, you worked less, but you were also fed less. Because why waste food on idle hands? Then there are the mining slaves. If you were sent to a mine, you weren't expected to survive long. 2 years, maybe 3 if you were strong. Mining in medieval times was horrifically dangerous. Tunnels collapsed regularly. There was no ventilation, so the air was thick with dust and fumes. Lung disease was guaranteed. Slaves dug with primitive tools, picks, shovels, their hands. They hauled or in baskets on their backs. The weight crushed spines. The darkness drove some mad. In some mines, slaves worked by candlelight. In others, they worked in complete darkness, feeling their way along the walls. Cave-ins killed dozens at a time. When a tunnel collapsed, rescue efforts were minimal. If you were trapped, you died there. Your body stayed in the rubble. No funeral, no marker, just gone. And another slave was sent down to replace you. Galley slaves had perhaps the worst existence of all, chained to rowing benches on warships and trading vessels. Imagine you're a galley slave. You're shackled by the ankle to a wooden bench. The chain is just long enough to let you row. 20 or 30 other men are chained on the same bench. The drum beats. You row. The drum beats faster. You row faster. For hours, days, weeks. You eat at your bench. A bowl of slop passed down the line. You drink at your bench. Stale water from a shared ladle. You defecate at your bench. There's a bucket if you're lucky. If not, you just go. The smell is unbearable. The air below deck is thick with sweat, urine, and despair. Some men go mad. They scream. They thrash. The overseers beat them into silence or throw them overboard. When the ship is in battle, you keep rowing. Arrows fly overhead. The ship rocks violently. If the ship sinks, you drown. You can't swim because you're chained. Some captains unchain galley slaves during battle so they can help fight. But most don't. You're expendable. If the ship goes down, another crew of slaves will be chained to another ship. The cycle continues. Galley slaves rarely lasted more than a few years. The physical strain was too much. Muscles tore, joints dislocated, spines bent. And when you couldn't row anymore, you were thrown overboard. Alive or dead, it didn't matter. You were no longer useful, so you were gone. Now let's talk about the psychological divide. Skilled slaves sometimes look down on unskilled slaves. It's a harsh truth, but it happened. When you're barely surviving, you cling to any scrap of status. A blacksmith slave might think, at least I'm not in the fields. A scribe slave might think, at least I'm not in the mines. This wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. If you acknowledged that you were all equally powerless, the despair might drown you. So you found tiny hierarchies, tiny reasons to feel like you mattered. But here's the thing. Skilled or unskilled, valuable or expendable, you were all slaves. You all woke to the same lack of freedom. You all lived under the same threat of violence. And you all knew that your life could change in an instant. A blacksmith slave could be sold to a mine. A scribe could be sent to the fields. Value was temporary. Ownership was permanent. The afternoon wore on. Skilled slaves continued their careful work, knowing one mistake could cost them their privilege. Unskilled slaves continued their brutal labor, knowing there was no escape except death. And all of them, every single one, counted the hours until nightfall. Not because night brought rest, but because it brought an end to the visibility. In the dark, For just a few hours, you could pretend you were something other than property. Number 5. Evening, master's entertainment. Evening arrives. The sun is setting. For free people, this is when the day softens, when work ends and leisure begins. But for slaves, evening is just another shift. And often, it's the most humiliating one. Because this is when you're not just a worker. You're entertainment. You're decoration. You're a living prop in someone else's life. Let's start with the serving slaves. If you're a household slave in a noble estate, evening means serving dinner. And this isn't a casual meal. Medieval nobles took their evening meals seriously. Multiple courses, elaborate presentations, guests to impress, and every detail had to be perfect. You're standing in the kitchen now. The cook is barking orders. Plates are being loaded with roasted meats, pies, fruit, cheese. You balance a heavy tray and walk carefully into the great hall. The hall is bright with torches and candles. The master sits at the head of the table. His family and guests surround him. You approach silently. You've been trained in what's called invisible service. You move like a ghost. You place dishes without making a sound. You pour wine without spilling a drop. You stand against the wall when not needed, so still you might as well be furniture. This is your job, to serve without being seen, to be present but not noticed. But here's the cruelty of it. You're constantly watched. If you make a mistake, if you drop something or spill wine or serve from the wrong side, everyone sees. And punishment is immediate. Sometimes it's verbal, a shout, an insult. Sometimes it's physical, a slap in front of the guests. Sometimes it's delayed. After the guests leave, you're dragged to the cellar and whipped. The punishment isn't just about the mistake. It's about reminding you of your place. You exist to serve. And if you fail, you suffer. Some slaves were trained from childhood for this role. They were taught elaborate protocols. How to carry a tray. How to carve meat. How to present food. How to bow. How to stand. Every movement was choreographed. And any deviation was punished. The goal was to create slaves who were so well trained they seemed almost mechanical. Perfect servants who anticipated needs before they were spoken. Now let's talk about the entertainment slaves. Because some slaves weren't just serving dinner. They were part of the show. Musicians, dancers, jesters, acrobats. In wealthier households, especially in Islamic Spain and the Byzantine Empire, slaves were trained in the arts. A slave musician might play the lute or the oud beautifully, but he didn't play for himself. He played because he was ordered to. His music was owned. His talent was property. Dancer slaves, often women, performed for guests. They wore elaborate costumes. They moved gracefully, and they smiled. Always smiled, even if they were exhausted, even if they were in pain. The smile was part of the performance. A dancer who looked unhappy was punished. So you learned to separate your face from your feelings. You performed joy while feeling nothing. Some slaves were jesters. They told jokes. They did tricks. They made fools of themselves to entertain the master and his guests. This role was deeply humiliating. You were being laughed at, not with. And if your jokes weren't funny enough, if the guests weren't entertained, you were punished. Some jesters developed sharp wits and clever wordplay as a survival mechanism. If you could make the master laugh, you were safer. But it was a dangerous game. One wrong joke, one line that offended, and you were done. In some regions, especially in Italy and Spain, there were gladiator-style entertainments. Not quite the Roman arena, but close enough. Slaves were forced to fight each other for the amusement of nobles, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with their bare hands. These fights were rarely to the death, but injuries were common. Broken bones, deep cuts, concussions, and the crowd cheered. They bet on outcomes. They ate and drank while you bled. If you were a slave forced to fight, you had no choice. You entered the ring knowing that losing meant punishment. Winning meant you'd have to do it again. There was no victory, just survival. Some slaves became skilled fighters. They learned to put on a good show without actually killing their opponent. Because killing another slave meant one less person in your situation. One less person who understood. Then there were the sex slaves. This is the darkest part of evening. And it's a reality we can't ignore. Women and young men were kept specifically for sexual exploitation. They were dressed up, displayed, used, and discarded. There was no consent. Consent requires freedom. They had none. Some masters kept harems. Rooms full of enslaved women who existed solely for sexual availability. These women lived in a strange isolation. They weren't worked in the fields or kitchens. But their enslavement was no less brutal. Their bodies were not their own. Their futures were erased. And if they became pregnant, their children were born into the same system. Male sex slaves existed too. Young boys and teenagers kept by wealthy men. This practice was more common in certain regions, particularly in Islamic courts and Byzantine aristocracy. These boys were often castrated to keep them controllable. They lived in a state of psychological torment, used and then expected to serve loyally. Some were eventually freed as adults, but they were left scarred, physically and emotionally, for life. Let's talk about the protocols slaves had to follow during these evening events. Because it wasn't just about serving or performing. It was about absolute, perfect obedience to rules that could change without warning. You had to know how to enter a room properly. Always from the side, never through the main entrance. You had to know how to bow. How low depended on who was present. A deeper bow for the master. A slight nod for lesser nobles. No acknowledgement at all for other servants. You had to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Generally, you never spoke unless directly addressed. And when you did speak, your voice had to be soft, deferential, stripped of personality. You answered questions with yes, master, or no, my lord. Nothing more. Never an opinion. Never an observation. You were a speaking tool, nothing more. Eye contact was forbidden. Looking directly at the master or his guests was considered insolent. You kept your gaze down, on the floor, on your hands, anywhere but on their faces. This was psychological. By forcing you to avert your eyes, they reinforced the power dynamic. They could look at you, examine you, judge you, but you couldn't look back. You couldn't meet them as an equal, even in something as simple as a glance. Mistakes during these evening services were harshly punished. Drop a plate? You might be struck immediately, in front of everyone. Spill wine on a guest? You could be whipped later, after the guests left, when no one could hear you scream. Serve food in the wrong order? Stand in the wrong place? Breathe too loudly? All punishable offenses. The rules were exhaustive and often arbitrary. They existed not just to maintain order, but to maintain fear. Some slaves developed elaborate coping mechanisms. They dissociated mentally. They learned to separate their consciousness from their body. While their hands poured wine and carried platters, their minds went elsewhere. To memories of home. To fantasies of freedom. To prayers. To nothing at all. This mental escape was sometimes the only way to survive the humiliation of being treated like an object in a room full of people. Other slaves coped through small acts of rebellion. A serving slave might spit in the master's soup when no one was looking. A musician might deliberately play a note slightly off-key, so subtle only another musician would notice. A dancer might stumble just enough to disrupt the performance without it seeming intentional. These tiny rebellions meant nothing to the masters, but to the slaves, they were everything. They were proof that you still had a will, even if you couldn't act on it. In some households, particularly in Islamic Spain and the Byzantine Empire, there were slave orchestras. Groups of enslaved musicians who performed together. These orchestras were status symbols. The more skilled your slave musicians, the wealthier and more cultured you appeared. The slaves practiced for hours, perfecting complex pieces. They performed flawlessly, and they did it all knowing that their talent would never benefit them. They couldn't use their skills to earn money. They couldn't leave and join another ensemble. Their music was beautiful, and it was a prison. Female slaves who served at evening meals faced additional dangers. They were sexually vulnerable. A drunk guest might grab them. A master might follow them to the kitchen afterward. There was no protection, no one to report to. If you were assaulted, you stayed silent. Because reporting it meant nothing. You had no legal standing. And if the master decided you were causing trouble by speaking up, you could be sold to a worse situation. So you endured. You learned to avoid certain men. You learned to move quickly. You learned to make yourself as unappealing as possible, hunching your shoulders, avoiding eye contact, trying to become invisible. Some nobles played games with their slaves during these evening gatherings. Cruel games designed to humiliate. They might order two slaves to fight each other over a scrap of food. They might make a slave sing a humiliating song about themselves. They might force a slave to drink until they vomited, then punish them for making a mess. These games were entertainment for the masters. For the slaves, they were psychological torture. You were being degraded for amusement, and you had to participate because refusal meant worse punishment. Evening was also when some slaves were displayed like artwork. In wealthy Byzantine households, particularly beautiful slaves were dressed in fine clothes and positioned around the room like living statues. They stood perfectly still for hours while guests admired them. They were talked about as if they weren't there. Look at the bone structure on that one. The coloring is quite exotic. They were reduced to aesthetic objects. Their humanity stripped away completely. Child slaves had it especially hard during evening events. They were often used as pages, running messages and fetching items. They were small, fast, and easy to overlook. But they were also vulnerable. A bored noble might trip a child slave just to watch them fall. Guests might toss scraps of food at them like feeding dogs. And if the child showed fear or sadness, they were punished for displaying emotion. Children learned early to bury their feelings deep. The evening meals often stretched for hours. Course after course. Conversation. Music. Wine. For the nobles, it was leisure. For the slaves, it was endurance. You stood for hours. Your feet ached. Your back hurt. Your arms trembled from carrying heavy trays. But you didn't sit. You didn't rest. You remained ready, alert, waiting for the next command. And when the meal finally ended, when the guests finally left, your work still wasn't done. You had to clear the table, wash the dishes, scrub the pots, clean the hall, put everything away. This could take hours. By the time you were finished, it might be midnight or later. You'd been awake for nearly 20 hours. You were exhausted, hungry, and emotionally drained. But before you could collapse, before you could return to your straw bed, you had one more task. You had to prepare for tomorrow. Lay out the master's clothes. Set the breakfast table. Make sure everything was ready for the next day to begin. Because in a few short hours, someone would kick your leg or bang on the wall, and it would start all over again. Evening was supposed to be the gentle part of the day. But for slaves, gentleness didn't exist. There was only service. Only performance. Only the constant, grinding awareness that you existed for someone else's pleasure. And when you finally did lie down, you didn't dream of freedom. You were too tired to dream at all. Number 6. Night. Dreams of freedom. Finally, night arrives. The masters have retired. The household is quiet. The fires are banked. And you're lying on your straw mattress, body aching, mind exhausted. This is the only time you have for yourself. These few hours between collapse and wake up. And in these hours, something important happens. You remember you're human. Privacy is almost non-existent for slaves. You share sleeping spaces with others. Sometimes 10, 15, or 20 people crammed into a storage room, a cellar, or a corner of the stable. There are no walls, no doors, no curtains. You sleep within arm's reach of others, hearing their breathing, their coughs, their quiet weeping. But in this communal suffering, something develops. A network, a community, an underground communication system that masters never fully see. When the household is asleep, slaves talk. Quietly, carefully. These conversations are dangerous. If you're caught, you're punished. But they happen anyway because humans need connection. You share stories. Where you came from. Who you were before. A farmer's son from a Slavic village. A merchant's daughter from North Africa. A fisherman from a coastal town. These stories are painful, but they're also proof. Proof that you existed before slavery. That you had a life, a name, an identity. Some slaves used this time to teach each other. An older slave who remembered freedom might teach younger ones about their culture. Languages, songs, traditions. This was resistance. The masters wanted you to forget. To become blank slates, useful only for labor. But in the dark, you fought that erasure. You held on to fragments of who you were. You passed them down like sacred texts. In some slave communities, particularly where Christian slaves lived under Muslim masters or vice versa, religion became a quiet act of defiance. Christian slaves prayed in whispers. They made small crosses from twigs and hid them. They recited Bible verses from memory because they weren't allowed to own Bibles. Muslim slaves faced Mecca and prayed silently. They fasted during Ramadan even though their work schedules didn't accommodate it. They held on to their faith because it was one thing that couldn't be taken away. These religious practices weren't just about belief. They were about identity. About maintaining a sense of self when everything else was stripped away. A Christian slave praying in secret was saying, "I am more than property. I am a person with a soul." A Muslim slave fasting was declaring, "My body may be owned, but my spirit is mine." Lullabies and songs were powerful tools for preserving identity. Mothers sang to their children in their native languages. Songs about home, about ancestors, about freedom. These lullabies weren't just comfort. They were history lessons. They were resistance. When a mother sang to her child about a homeland the child would never see, she was making sure that homeland wasn't forgotten. She was planting seeds of memory that might one day grow into something more. Some slaves wrote letters. Not real letters, because most couldn't write, and even fewer had access to paper. But mental letters. Letters composed in their heads, addressed to people they'd lost. Dear Mother, I don't know if you're alive. But if you are, I want you to know I'm surviving. I haven't forgotten you. I haven't forgotten home. These letters were never sent. They existed only in thought. But they mattered. They were a way of maintaining relationships that slavery tried to sever. Now let's talk about escape. Because in these quiet night hours, some slaves planned. Escape attempts were rare and almost always unsuccessful. The risks were enormous. If you were caught, punishment ranged from brutal beatings to mutilation to execution. In some regions, escaped slaves had their feet branded or their Achilles tendons cut, so they couldn't run again. In others, they were hanged publicly as a warning to other slaves. But despite the risks, people tried. Because hope is stubborn. Even when logic says it's hopeless, hope whispers, maybe. Escape planning was done in absolute secrecy. You trusted only one or two others. You observed patterns. When did the overseers sleep most soundly? Which nights had no moon? Where were the dogs kept? What roads led away from the estate? This information was gathered slowly, over months or years. Most escape attempts failed within days. You didn't know the terrain. You had no food, no money, no contacts. You were easily recognizable as a slave, especially if you wore distinctive clothing or bore scars or brands. And medieval communities were small and interconnected. If you showed up in a new village, people asked questions. Where are you from? Who's your master? Why are you traveling alone? A single wrong answer and you were reported. Some slaves tried to escape to religious sanctuaries. In Christian territories, churches sometimes offered asylum. If you reached a church and claimed sanctuary, theoretically you were protected. But this protection was often temporary. The church might negotiate with your master. You might be returned under promise of lighter punishment. Or you might be allowed to stay, but essentially become a slave of the church instead. Freedom was still out of reach. In Islamic territories, some slaves tried to convert to Islam, hoping it would lead to freedom. Islamic law did provide some protections for Muslim slaves and encouraged manumission. But conversion didn't guarantee freedom. Many masters found ways around it. They'd claim you converted for convenience, not faith. Or they'd simply ignore the religious guidelines because enforcement was inconsistent. The few successful escapes usually involved networks. In some regions, there were underground networks of freed slaves, sympathetic merchants, or religious groups who helped escapees. These networks were small and carefully hidden. They couldn't help everyone. But occasionally, someone made it through. They reached a city where they could blend in. Or a territory where slavery was less common. Or a community that protected them. These success stories became legends among slaves. Whispered tales of so-and-so who made it to freedom. These stories were probably exaggerated. But they gave hope. Most slaves, though, never attempted escape. Not because they didn't want freedom, but because they couldn't afford to fail. If you had family, escape meant abandoning them. If you were caught, your punishment might be extended to others as a warning. And if you were one of the more valuable slaves, a skilled craftsman, or a household favorite, you knew your chances of reaching freedom were even lower because more resources would be spent hunting you down. So instead of escaping, you dreamed. You lay in the dark and imagined what freedom would feel like. To wake without fear. To work for yourself. To choose where to go, what to eat, who to love. These dreams were bittersweet. They were comforting and torturous at the same time. Comfort because they reminded you what you were missing. Torture because you knew they might never be real. Some slaves found small moments of joy even in captivity. A shared laugh with another slave. A kind word exchanged when the overseer wasn't looking. A moment of natural beauty, a sunrise or a bird singing, that reminded you the world contained more than suffering. These moments didn't erase the horror of slavery, but they made it bearable. Just barely. Night was also when grief surfaced. During the day, you suppressed it. You couldn't afford to feel too much because feeling meant breaking, and breaking meant punishment. But at night, in the dark, grief emerged. You cried silently for your lost family, for your stolen life, for the person you might have become if you'd been free. This grief was a weight you carried alone because sharing it too openly meant burdening others who were already drowning. Some slaves lost hope entirely. They stopped talking, stopped eating, stopped caring. This psychological break was common. When the mind can't endure anymore, it shuts down. Some slaves simply waited to die. They performed their tasks mechanically, but the spark was gone. Others took more active measures. Suicide was rare because most religious traditions forbade it. But it happened. A slave might walk into a river and not come out, or hang themselves in the barn, or simply refuse food until their body gave up. But most held on, not because they believed freedom was coming, but because humans are survival machines. We endure. We adapt. We find reasons to keep going even when there are no good reasons. Maybe it was a child you wanted to protect. Maybe it was a promise you made to someone you lost. Maybe it was just stubbornness. But you kept going, night after night, year after year. And then, just as you were drifting into uneasy sleep, morning came again. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., the kick to your leg, the shout, the beginning of another day identical to the last. And you stood up, because you had no choice. Because this was your life. Because the cycle continues until it doesn't. Number 7. The cycle repeats. Until when? So how long did this continue? How long did someone remain a slave? The answer depended on many factors. Where you were, who owned you, what skills you had, and mostly luck. For many, the answer was simple and brutal. You were a slave until you died. That was it. You were born into slavery or captured into it, and you died in it. Your children were born slaves. Their children too. Generational slavery was common. Entire families trapped in the system for centuries. But there were rare exceptions. Rare paths to freedom. Let's talk about manumission. This is the formal term for a master freeing a slave. It sounds hopeful, but the reality was complicated. Manumission was extremely uncommon. Most masters had no reason to free their slaves. Slaves were valuable. They were investments. Freeing them meant losing that investment. So why would they? Some masters freed slaves in their wills. A deathbed gesture, perhaps motivated by guilt or religious belief. When I die, my personal servant shall be freed. This happened, but not often. And even when it did, the freed person faced immediate problems. They had no money, no property, no skills that translated to free labor markets. They were suddenly legally free, but practically helpless. Many freed slaves ended up in poverty, barely surviving. Sometimes even worse off than they were in slavery, because at least slavery guaranteed food and shelter. Some slaves could purchase their freedom. This was more common in Islamic territories where law encouraged it. A slave could make an agreement with their master. I will pay you X amount over Y years, and then I'm free. But how did a slave earn money? Some skilled slaves were allowed to take on side work. A blacksmith slave might repair tools for neighbors in his spare time and keep a small portion of the payment. Over decades, this might add up to enough for freedom. But decades is a long time, and masters could change the terms at any moment. Actually, the price just went up. There was no legal protection, no contract enforcement, just the master's whim. In some cases, slaves were freed as rewards for exceptional service. A slave who saved the master's life. A slave who discovered a plot against the household. A slave who demonstrated extraordinary loyalty. These stories exist in historical records. But they're exceptions, not patterns. And even these freed slaves often remained tied to their former masters through debt or social obligation. I'm free, but I owe everything to my former master, so I continue serving them, just without the legal title of slave. The chains were gone, but the cage remained. Religious manumission was another path. In Christianity, freeing a slave was sometimes considered a pious act, especially during holy seasons like Easter. In Islam, freeing a believing slave was encouraged as a way to atone for sins. But even religious manumission was limited. It applied more readily to slaves who converted to the master's religion. And even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Religious law encouraged freedom, but secular law and economic incentives often overrode it. Women had additional, darker paths to freedom. A female slave who became a master's concubine might be freed upon his death, especially if she bore him children. But this wasn't freedom through merit. It was freedom through sexual exploitation. And it came with conditions. The woman might be free legally, but socially she was still marked. Former slave, concubine. Her children might be recognized as the master's heirs, or they might not. It depended entirely on the master's decision and local customs. For the vast majority of slaves, though, these paths were fantasies. You didn't save the master's life. You didn't earn enough to buy freedom. You weren't freed in a will. You simply worked, day after day, year after year, until your body couldn't work anymore. And then what? Old or disabled slaves faced terrible fates. If you could no longer work, you had no value. Some masters kept elderly slaves out of a sense of obligation or habit. You were given the lightest tasks: watching children, mending clothes, sitting by the fire, and telling stories. But many masters didn't keep unproductive slaves. They were sold to less wealthy owners who needed cheap labor, or they were simply abandoned, turned out to fend for themselves. An elderly slave with no skills, no money, and no support system usually died quickly. Starvation, exposure, illness, death, then, was the most common escape. You worked until you died, and even your death didn't always free you from the system. Your body might be tossed in a mass grave with other slaves. No marker, no funeral, no acknowledgement that you had lived. You simply stopped existing, and another slave took your place. Let's talk about the transition to serfdom. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly in Western Europe, chattel slavery gradually declined. It didn't disappear, but it shifted. Slaves became serfs. Serfs were still unfree. They were still tied to land and to lords. But they had some legal protections slaves didn't. They couldn't be sold separately from the land. They had some rights to property. They could marry without permission. These seem like small differences, but to someone living through it, they mattered. This transition wasn't motivated by morality. It was economics and politics. Serfdom was more stable than slavery. Serfs had a stake in the land, which made them more productive. They had families and communities, which made them less likely to rebel. And legally, serfs weren't property, which made the arrangement more palatable to Christian theology. But make no mistake, serfs were still unfree, still exploited, still trapped. The chains were just less visible. For slaves living during this transition, it was confusing and cruel. Some slaves were reclassified as serfs, which improved their legal standing, but not necessarily their daily lives. Others remained slaves because their masters refused to change the classification. And in regions outside Western Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and the Islamic world, chattel slavery continued for centuries more. So when did your slavery end? For most, the answer was never. You were born into it. You died in it. Your life was a cycle of labor, suffering, and erasure. The only hope was that maybe, just maybe, future generations would be slightly less unfree. That the system would slowly, incrementally shift towards something less brutal. But that hope was distant, abstract. It didn't help you in the moment. And yet, people kept going. They woke up at 3 a.m. They worked until they collapsed. They survived. Because that's what humans do. We endure. We find meaning in the smallest things. A kind word, a shared moment, a memory of home. And we hold on. Not because we believe things will get better, but because giving up means letting the system win completely. And even in slavery, even in total powerlessness, there's a tiny stubborn flame that refuses to be extinguished. Tomorrow, they'll wake up again at 3 a.m., and the day will repeat. The same work, the same pain, the same erasure, and the cycle continues. Until when? For most, until death. But the question itself is important. Because asking until when means acknowledging that this isn't permanent, that systems change, that history moves, and that even the most entrenched, brutal systems eventually fall. Medieval slavery did end. Not everywhere at once. Not cleanly. But gradually, over centuries, it transformed into other systems, some better, some just different. The people who lived through it didn't see that end. But we do. And part of why we're here tonight, talking about this uncomfortable history, is to remember them. To acknowledge that millions of people lived this reality. That their suffering was real. That their lives mattered even though the system tried to erase them. Number 8. Reflections and modern parallels. We've walked through a full day, 21 hours of labor, pain, and erasure. And now we need to sit with it. This is an ancient history. This is medieval history. This happened in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Islamic world, in Christian kingdoms. This was normal for hundreds of years. And an estimated 10 million people or more lived some version of this life during the medieval period alone. Let me be clear about something. This isn't a lecture about how bad the past was so we can feel good about the present. Because the uncomfortable truth is that slavery didn't end with the Middle Ages. It evolved. It found new forms. And some of those forms still exist today. Human trafficking is modern slavery. Right now, as you're watching this, millions of people are trapped in forced labor. Domestic workers held captive. Factory workers in debt bondage. Sex trafficking victims. Children sold to work in mines or fields. The mechanisms are different. The legal structures have changed. But the core reality, people being owned and exploited by other people, hasn't disappeared. I'm not going to preach. I'm not going to tell you what to do about it. But I'm going to say this. Knowing history matters. Understanding how these systems worked, how they were justified, how they persisted for centuries, that knowledge helps us recognize when similar patterns appear in our own time. The justifications change. The laws change. But the exploitation remains. Medieval people justified slavery in multiple ways. Religious difference, cultural superiority, economic necessity. These people aren't like us. They're better off under our control. The economy depends on this system. Sound familiar? These are the same arguments used to justify exploitation across history, and they're still used today in different forms. One of the most insidious aspects of slavery, medieval or otherwise, is invisibility. Slaves were everywhere in medieval society, but they were treated as invisible. They served food but weren't seen. They built buildings but weren't credited. They raised children but weren't acknowledged as caregivers. This invisibility was intentional. It allowed free people to benefit from slavery without confronting its reality. We do similar things today. We benefit from systems of exploitation without seeing the people trapped in them. The cheap products we buy, the convenient services we use. Somewhere in those supply chains, there might be people working in conditions not far removed from what we've discussed tonight. We don't see them. They're invisible. Just like medieval slaves were invisible to the people they served. I'm not saying you're personally responsible for global exploitation. That's not the point. The point is that invisibility is a tool. It was used in medieval times to maintain slavery without moral discomfort. And it's still used today. Making people visible, acknowledging their humanity, recognizing their suffering. That's the first step toward change. It's not the only step, but it's the first one. Let's talk about resilience. Because that's the other side of this story. Yes, medieval slaves suffered horribly, but they also resisted. They held on to their identities. They protected their cultures. They found ways to be human even when the system tried to reduce them to tools. That resistance, quiet and persistent, eventually contributed to the system's transformation. Slaves sang songs that preserved their languages. They told stories that kept their histories alive. They formed relationships even when forbidden. They prayed in secret. They planned escapes even when escape was nearly impossible. They survived. And survival, in a system designed to break you, is itself an act of resistance. This matters because it reminds us that people in oppressive systems aren't just victims. They're also agents. They make choices, however limited. They find meaning, however small. They resist, however quietly. The medieval slaves we've talked about tonight weren't passive. They were active participants in their own survival. And many of them would have been astonished to know that centuries later, we'd be talking about them, acknowledging their existence, honoring their struggles. History isn't just about the powerful. It's about everyone. The kings and queens get the monuments and the history books. But the real story of any era includes the people who cleaned the floors, cooked the food, and built the walls. Medieval slaves were the backbone of medieval economy. Without their labor, the castles don't get built. The fields don't get harvested. The households don't function. They were essential, and they were erased. Part of why I wanted to make this video, why we've spent over an hour and a half walking through this day, is to push back against that erasure. To say, these people existed. Their lives were hard. Their suffering was real. And they deserve to be remembered. Not as abstract statistics. Not as background scenery in someone else's story. But as individuals who woke up every morning, endured impossible circumstances, and somehow kept going. There's a tendency in history to sanitize the past. To focus on the art, the architecture, the great leaders, and great battles. And those things are important, but they're built on foundations of suffering. Medieval cathedrals are beautiful. They're also built by people who had no choice but to build them. Medieval monasteries preserved knowledge. They also owned slaves who worked their lands. The Silk Roads facilitated trade and cultural exchange. They also facilitated slave trade on a massive scale. We can acknowledge both. We can appreciate medieval achievements while also confronting medieval atrocities. In fact, we have to. Because understanding the full picture, the beauty, and the brutality is the only way to actually learn from history. Let me end this section with a thought. Every person we've talked about tonight, the field slave, the blacksmith, the galley slave, the serving girl, every single one of them was a complete human being. They had thoughts, feelings, dreams, fears. They loved people. They missed people. They hoped for things. They were complex, just like you and me. But the system they lived in tried to reduce them to simple functions. Laborer, servant, property. The ultimate injustice of slavery isn't just the physical suffering. It's the theft of personhood, the reduction of a complete human life to a single, simple role. When we remember medieval slaves, we're pushing back against that theft. We're saying, you were more than your function. You were people, and you mattered. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Number 9, closing thoughts. We're at the end now. We've spent nearly 2 hours following a medieval slave through a single day. From the pre-dawn wake-up to the nighttime dreams of freedom. We've seen the brutality, the exploitation, the small resistances, and the quiet resilience. And hopefully, we've gained some understanding of what life was actually like for millions of people across medieval Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. This wasn't an easy topic. I know that. You probably didn't click on this video expecting to feel comfortable. Medieval slavery is ugly. It's painful, and it's real. But uncomfortable history is important history. Because if we only study the parts of the past that make us feel good, we're not actually learning. We're just consuming entertainment. Real history includes everything. The achievements and the atrocities. The beauty and the brutality. And when we engage with the full picture, we become better equipped to understand our own time. We see patterns. We recognize warning signs. We understand how systems of oppression work and how they're justified. And maybe, just maybe, we become less willing to accept those systems in the present. I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. Guilt about things you didn't do and couldn't have prevented isn't useful. What is useful is awareness, understanding, and a commitment to recognizing injustice when we see it, whether it's in history or in our own time. Medieval slavery lasted for hundreds of years because people accepted it, because the legal system supported it, because the religious authorities found ways to justify it, because the economy depended on it, and because free people benefited from it without having to confront what it actually meant. Those same dynamics exist today in different forms. And our responsibility, if we choose to accept it, is to not look away. The medieval slaves we've talked about tonight are gone. Their suffering is over. We can't change what happened to them, but we can remember them. We can tell their stories. We can refuse to let them be invisible any longer. And we can use their stories to inform how we engage with injustice in our own time. Tomorrow, if this were the Middle Ages, those slaves would wake up at 3 a.m. again. The cycle would repeat. The work would continue. The suffering would persist. But eventually, the system changed. Not because the powerful suddenly developed consciences, but because people resisted. Because economic systems shifted. Because ideas about human rights slowly, painfully gained ground. Change happened. Slowly. Incompletely. But it happened. And that's maybe the one hopeful note in this entire story. No system lasts forever. No matter how entrenched, how brutal, how seemingly permanent, systems change. People endure. And eventually, through resistance, evolution, and sometimes revolution, oppressive systems fall or transform into something different. Not always something better, but different. And different means the possibility of better. So what do you do with this information? That's up to you. Maybe you walk away thinking about history differently. Maybe you start noticing invisibility in your own world. Maybe you look into organizations fighting modern slavery. Maybe you just sit with the discomfort for a while and let it shape how you see things. All of those are valid responses. What I hope you don't do is forget. Because these people, these millions of medieval slaves, deserve to be remembered. Not as abstract victims, but as complex humans who lived, suffered, resisted, and endured. They're part of our shared history. And forgetting them is another kind of erasure. Before we end, I want to say thank you. Thank you for staying with this topic for 2 hours. I know it wasn't easy. This kind of content doesn't always do well. People prefer lighter subjects, understandably. But the fact that you're here, that you watched or listened to this entire thing, means something. It means you value real history, even when it's uncomfortable. It means you're willing to confront the past honestly. And that matters. If you found value in this, if you think this kind of deep historical exploration is important, consider subscribing. Not for me, but because it tells the algorithm that there's an audience for substantive, difficult content. And the more that audience exists, the more creators will make content like this. History that doesn't shy away from the hard parts. History that remembers everyone, not just the powerful. Leave a comment if you want. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what struck you most about this story. Tell me if there's other uncomfortable history you think we should explore. This channel is about diving deep into the parts of history that often get skipped over. The daily lives of ordinary people. The systems that shaped their existence. The struggles that usually don't make it into textbooks. And your engagement helps determine what we explore next. One last thing. If this video made you think, made you feel something, or taught you something you didn't know, share it. Not for the algorithm, though that helps, but because these stories need to reach more people. Medieval slavery isn't taught much in schools. It's overshadowed by Roman slavery and Atlantic slavery. But it happened. It was massive in scale, and it shaped the medieval world in fundamental ways. More people should know that. All right, we're done. It's been a journey. A dark, difficult, necessary journey. Thank you for taking it with me. Remember them. Remember the field slave who woke at 3 a.m. Remember the galley slave chained to his oar. Remember the serving girl who stood invisible in the corner. Remember the blacksmith who took pride in work that wasn't his. Remember the mother who sang lullabies in a language her children would forget. Remember them all. History isn't just dates and battles and kings. It's people. All people. Even the ones the system tried to erase. Especially the ones the system tried to erase. Because they lived. They mattered. And their stories deserve to be told. Tomorrow, we'll cover something different. But tonight, we remember them. The forgotten millions. The invisible laborers. The medieval slaves. They endured so much. The least we can do is remember. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And don't look away from uncomfortable truths. That's where the real learning happens.